Hey there riders, Moto Journo Kris here today. I wanted to have a very quick chat about the Vulcan S compared to the new Eliminator 450 or 500, depending on how you kind of look at that bike, which are the two cruiser options from Kawasaki. I recently tested out the Eliminator and was really impressed with that bike. It is a small, sporty cruiser. It is a 451cc. It is a parallel twin, like the Vulcan S, which is very common in the new cruisers, and it is quite a futuristic styled cruiser. There are some kind of traditional aspects to it, but overall, blacked out engine, quite bright paint, unless you look at the blacked out version, the totally blacked out version, and it's quite modern. It also has phone connectivity, and in comparison, the Vulcan S, I think too, carries that quite modern styling. It's obviously not a totally traditional cruiser, it's not dripping in chrome, and it's, you know, a little bit more colorful in some cases, depending what color you pick, than the quite traditional, normally blacked out cruisers with the chrome. But both of these bikes are exceptional machines. Both of them are LAMS legal here in Australia, which is kind of the equivalent of an A2 version, 35 kilowatts on the Vulcan S. I think with the Eliminator, it's 33.4 kilowatts, so it is a restricted version of the 450 as well. And basically the difference between the two bikes is about 10 or 12 newton meters of torque, which may not seem like much if you're used to seeing kind of full performance figures on bigger bikes, but it is very, very noticeable between the two machines. As far as the engine characteristics, that new 450 is very, very torquey, but not compared to a 650. So it's got a more taut kind of torque delivery. It is a little bit more relaxed than the Ninja and the Z500 in comparison, but that Eliminator has very, very nice torque for a 400cc class bike, which is what you want in a cruiser. And certainly the Eliminator was the first of the models to bring that engine out. And you can see why it is quite cruiser kind of built, I would say. I feel like it suits the Eliminator more than it suits the Ninja 500 and the Z500 for comparison. It is a little bit vibey through the mid-range, but that does drop away if you rev through it. And that was probably my one complaint with the Eliminator, apart from the gearbox being surprisingly hard to shift gears at times. And I checked the clutch adjustment, I was making sure I was pulling the clutch in. It has a very, very light clutch, but the Eliminator, for whatever reason, I guess it's got a lot more torque than the old 399cc engines did. However, it's got a clunkier gearbox and it's got some vibes, which I never remember the Ninja 400 having. In comparison, the Vulcan S is super, super smooth. It's much torqueier. It's perhaps not as smooth on the throttle. So there were times that I did need to use a little bit of clutch to feather the power and just to smooth things out a little bit, just because the power transitions could be rougher. And that's, I think, because there's just more torque and more power on this bike, which is unsurprising for a 650. It's still a nice and light clutch, if not as light as the Eliminator, which isn't surprising. And between the two, I will say if you're an absolute fan of kind of the more low down torque, obviously the Vulcan will be the winner. If you're looking for the most performance you can get for a beginner or an intermediate bike in the class, obviously again, the Vulcan's gonna win. But if you really like revving the bike out and having a lot of fun, riding it a bit more sportily and it being a lighter machine, the Eliminator is gonna win there. And the two bikes are quite similar in the suspension loadout. Both have 41mm forks. This has a monoshock, an offset monoshock, and the Eliminator has the dual shocks on the rear with preload adjustability. So preload on both machines. The Eliminator, I did find, was a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more controlled at the rear, where this could be a little bit harsh over some of the bumps in comparison. Both well within reason, both I would say pretty good for the style of bike. And where I'd say something like the Super Media, which is much plusher than the Vulcan S, was probably a little bit more comfortable than the Vulcan, just to introduce a whole different bike into the comparison. This is a much sportier machine, and then the Eliminator is sportier again, just because it's lighter and a little bit more nimble. And while they both carry their weight exceptionally well, and I would even say the Vulcan S was probably my preference between the two machines, the Eliminator is, at the end of the day, a much, much lighter machine, which for pushing it around and stuff like that is going to be easier, even though I think riding them, there's minimal differences, really. It's just that rear shock performance on the Eliminator, which comes out in front between these two models. As far as brakes, both have a single front disc, a single rear disc as well. The Eliminator being a much, much lighter machine, those brakes work a lot more effectively on both ends. On the Vulcan S, the front brake is quite light on bite and power. Most of your braking performance is at the rear, but that's not really a problem. That's fairly normal for a cruiser. So certainly in that regard, I think it's pretty even between the two bikes. They both have ABS as well here in Australia and will have in most markets. I think it's mandatory in most places except the US now. And so that is nice to see. But there's no traction control, there's no ride-by-wire, there's no ride modes on any of them. It's just the Eliminator getting the phone connectivity, which I guess from like a learner perspective, I don't think you should be messing around with a phone while you're riding. And while most of the features on it are very much kind of more something that you'd check after your ride, like it can do your routes and things like that by using your GPS. I'm not a huge fan of the mobile phone stuff on beginner motorcycles. And obviously the Vulcan having it or not having it at all is hardly a problem for me. But if you really like your phone connectivity, maybe it will be an issue. Between the two bikes, I did like the fact the Eliminator had the LED headlight, tail light indicators. This, I'm not even sure that the headlight is LED or the indicators. The indicators I don't think are. This is an older school bike, but it works in some ways to its favor, I think, if you're looking for the more basic machine. This is a more basic bike in some ways, and I don't think that's too much of a criticism. It certainly wouldn't detract from me looking at buying one of these bikes over the Eliminator. The price difference here in Australia is $1,600, which I think is really quite small. I'm kind of surprised that the Eliminator isn't under 10K. For instance, the Z500 is I think about 9K, and the Eliminator is 10.7 right away. The Vulcan S is 12.3 right away, and so it's not an enormous jump in price, being brutally honest, between those two bikes. I mean, it's a handful of cash. It's quite a bit of cash, but I feel like the Eliminator probably should be down closer to the Z500, realistically speaking. But I am an enormous tight ass, so my ideas of pricing aren't always very real to the world. However, I guess probably because the Eliminator is brand new, there's some different kind of economies of scale going on between the two machines. Obviously a big advantage to the Vulcan is the lower seat height. 705mm seat height is 30 mils lower, or a bit over an inch compared to the Eliminator. The Eliminator is a little bit more narrow and certainly, as I already mentioned, lighter, and the Vulcan has bar, peg and seat adjustability through the ErgoFit system. But in some countries, from what I've heard, that actually falls into the accessory range. So you do need an accessory shift rod for changing or massively changing the foot controls. I'm not sure if they just swap the seats around for you. And obviously there's a little bit of adjustability in the bars there, which is cool to see. And obviously the Eliminator doesn't have that and is the taller seat height. So if you're a shorter rider, you may find that the Eliminator is a little too tall for you. Although, I mean, it's going to vary. You'd have to be quite short for that to be the case because they're all cruisers and they all tend to be quite low. But I do think if you're being really careful, the Eliminator is the safer choice because it's so much lighter. 50 kilos is quite a bit of weight. Also, the Vulcan is a little bit more squat at the back than I would say the Eliminator is, despite the Eliminator having a 16-inch rear and I think an 18 front. I think this has an 18 front and a 17 rear. This bike feels a little bit more tall on the front and low on the rear, where I feel like the Eliminator was a little more balanced. The Eliminator I actually felt was a bit more of a crossover between a naked bike and a cruiser, where this is pure cruiser. And each has their own strengths, but that's certainly something that I'd keep in mind. The Eliminator, as a result, through the twisties, is quite the weapon. It's great on the freeway as well because there's heaps and heaps of performance from that 450. You're not going to be lacking performance even if you're a heavier rider, but the Vulcan does just as well, much more effortlessly because of the 650 and the extra torque, and it's hard not to give the win to the Vulcan, particularly because it's smoother, where the vibes were a little bit annoying on the Eliminator, just through that little bit of the mid-range where they cropped up. So yeah, there is that to keep in mind. Apart from that, I guess I did honestly think from when I'd ridden the Vulcan years and years ago, I rode the Eliminator and I thought, wow, this is so good. And I was thinking the Vulcan, I feel like it's a little bit bigger and heavier, and it's just not going to compare as well to the new Eliminator. But then I jumped back on the Vulcan, and the Vulcan is exceptional. And as I said, while it's a little bit lower on the rear, a little bit taller on the front end, and the handling is a little bit more rear end orientated, you really feel like you're rolling kind of across that rear wheel for your handling, where the Eliminator is a little bit more like a naked bike. It's a little bit more balanced. It's not quite as low at the rear. Between the two, I had a hoot riding both of them through the twisties and going on some nice twisties this morning, which were just, 80k roads, just cruising along, having fun. This thing's so responsive and easy to ride. I was just blown away, and really, I don't think the Eliminator has that much of an advantage there. Perhaps a little bit of extra ground clearance, but really, there was nothing in it between the two bikes. So as far as brakes, I think they're pretty even. I would say the Eliminator being lighter and running a similar braking system is probably going to win on the outright braking performance if we're really pushing things. The engine in this, I do think being more torquey and is a little bit more traditionally cruiser as a result. But they're both parallel twins, so neither are V twins. The clutch and gearbox on this, I would prefer. The dash, again, I prefer having the tachometer, the analog tachometer and the LCD dash. I feel like that's a really nice combo on a machine like this. And while the Eliminator had the full LED lights, which I do prefer and think is a win there, it did also have the taller seat, which with the mid controls worked perfectly for me. But funnily enough, I preferred the slightly lower seat and the forward controls of the Vulcan S between those two models, particularly when we're talking a cruiser. Yeah, and apart from that, I mean, they're both great machines. Both of the bikes look awesome. I did test out the SE in the Eliminator, which I think is about $600 more, which brings it even closer to the Vulcan S, but it looked amazing in the orange, and I'll put some photos up of that bike. I love that bike, but certainly the Vulcan S, I would say, overall was the winner for me, but I can see where the Eliminator will be a winner for riders who like something a bit lighter, sportier, maybe a little bit taller isn't always going to be a bad thing for some riders, and without the forward controls, because not everyone likes that. And obviously saving a little bit of money is money you can put towards something else, and the Eliminator being a brand new bike, it'll probably hold its resale better for a couple of years until we see more of them on the market. So that's a huge advantage too when it comes to upgrading or reselling it, and that is always worthy of kind of note, I guess you'd say. Whether we see any issues with that 450 engine remains to be seen. The 650 is tried and true, and at the end of the day, they're both great machines. If you've got any specific questions about the two models or I've missed something, which I probably have, let me know down below in the comments. As always, stay safe out there, and thanks for watching.